Normally, the Tantalus crew would banter and exchange friendly quips at dinner, but tonight, there was a sullen silence in the mess hall. Fanzio had sensed this stifling atmosphere when he'd brought a light snack to the bridge a couple hours before dinner, and it had alarmed him. He even decided to whip up an extra dessert for dinner, a soufflé of Clanmodian swookstel. It was one of his specialties that he used to cheer up the crew. Fanzio had been working as a cook on freighter spaceships for decades and had a very high opinion of his profession. Everyone, as a child, dreams of becoming a captain or some other conqueror of something. Some even manage to make their dreams come true, and that's when they encounter the not-so-exciting reality. Spacefarers' lives, especially for those who work on big freighters, can't be called too exciting. For months, you are trapped in a giant tin can with the same people and the same monotonous work duties. After a while, only a few things remain to enjoy. To have a good tasty meal and to laugh heartily if someone still managed to dig out in the depths of memory some joke that has not yet been told 20 times already. And that's where the good cook comes in. The captain, chief mate, and bosun are responsible for the ship flying to the right place while not falling apart on the way and not looking like a rusty, battered trough. The cook, on the other hand, is a different matter. Fanzio was convinced that the cook, more than anyone else on the ship, was responsible for the crew's mood. Feed the men some tasteless junk, and they will walk all day, gloomy, silent, and interchange dry remarks. But set the tone right at the breakfast, with soft and fresh pancakes, with jam, and a juicy omelet, with bacon fried to a crisp, and you'll see that the people are cheerful. The chief mate doesn't pick on every man he meets for trifles, and the bosun doesn't scold the unfortunate cabin boy for the lost spare keys to the wardroom. Fanzio believed, and not without reason, that the crew's good mood was concentrated on the person on whom they depended for a good meal. So, Fanzio saw any indication that the crew was getting moody as a personal challenge, if not an insult. Especially in a situation like this. The Tantalus's hyperdrive had malfunctioned, and the ship had been drifting for the third day in a god-forsaken region of the galaxy, in a void between two spiral arms, where there were no decent stars, only scattered giant dust clouds and gas nebulas. The failure was not catastrophic, but the insurance fines for calling repairmen to such a remote area were truly galactic in scale. Nevertheless, repairing and checking all systems would take at least another week. No one wanted to risk a failure of the coordinates of the exit point from the hyperjump. That way, one could inadvertently end up anywhere, up to a supermassive black hole in the center of the galaxy. The Tantalus had been on a voyage without visits to intermediate spaceports for over a month now, and the delay of a week and a half had not been good for the already tired crew. Today, however, Fanzio could clearly sense a particularly oppressive atmosphere. As he left the bridge, he noticed Shankar Aswati, one of the assistant engineers, slamming his fist into the steel bulkhead several times with all his might, so his knuckles bled profusely. Fanzio immediately jumped up to Shankar and asked what had happened and if he needed help. But the engineer gave him a frantic look with bulging eyes and practically ran away from the bewildered cook. Fanzio only had time to notice that Shankar seemed to have hurt his arm badly. But he couldn't chase the engineer all over the ship, could he? This strange explosion of emotions was so unlike the always balanced, calm Shankar that Fanzio decided to go to Dr. Stankovsky later and ask him to keep a close eye on the engineer. And if even Shankar acted like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, what to say about the other crewmen? All these thoughts and memories overwhelmed Fanzio as he worked in the galley, trying to squeeze the most out of his culinary talent. The soufflé had been a success, and the main courses of the dinner, such as the vegetable-stewed fillet of hermit jumpers from Procyon, had also been excellent. It was all the sadder for Fanzio to see how indifferently almost everyone who came to dinner was picking at their plates with forks. Nothing frustrates a cook more than negligent attitude toward his talents. By the way, not everyone came to dinner. Some were on watch and would come later as soon as their shifts ended. But Fanzio noticed that Shankar, who had recently met him, and a couple of others, had not shown up in the mess hall. Under different circumstances, Fanzio probably wouldn't have given it much thought. There were plenty of reasons why someone would skip the dinner. However, it was somewhat frustrating for the cook as well. He wasn't used to having his meals neglected, but one might have napped before an unscheduled night watch, been engrossed in an exciting book, or simply had no appetite. Still, Fanzio decided to personally visit Shankar and see if he was all right. After all, the assistant engineer did not look so good at their previous meeting. So after dinner, Fanzio put a few servings in the refrigerator for those who would be coming in later from the watch, loaded the dirty dishes into the washing machine, put Shankar's dinner into food containers, and went to the second living deck, where the assistant engineer's quarters were located. On the way, Fanzio met another crew member he hadn't seen at dinner, Junior Navigator Kontonen. The tall, blonde-haired Mika was always happy to have a word or two with the cheerful cook, not least because he had a big appetite. This time, however, when Fanzio reminded him that he had, as usual, left a double portion of stewed hermit jumpers for Kontonen, Mika only glared down at him with his blue eyes. He was almost a head taller than the cook. Fanzio was struck by the unconcealed anger and hatred in that look. "Eat your own poison," Kontonen roared. "I'd rather live on canned food. It would be much healthier." His gaze fell on the containers of food for Shankar. "Looking for someone else to kill? Well, I won't interfere. It's every man for himself." Mika almost ran the remaining few meters to his cabin. The door slid into place with a slight whir and the click of the lock. For a few seconds, Fanzio stood motionless, his mouth open in surprise. What had happened was so unexpected, so out of place, that he wasn't even offended, but only confused. No one had ever spoken to him like that on the ship, or in his life for that matter, and he didn't know what to think. In the end, he just shrugged and continued to Shankar's quarters. The indicator light on the lock panel was green, which meant that the door to Shankar's quarters was unlocked, and its occupant was okay with having visitors. Of course, as was the ship's custom, Fanzio knocked on the door first, then put his palm to the lock. The door slid open to the side. At first, Fanzio couldn't believe his eyes. Seconds later, the food containers fell from his hands to the floor, and the cook rushed inside the cabin, even though he realized he was too late. Shankar was hanging from a noose he'd made from his pants belt. The assistant engineer had stripped the ceiling panels down to the support structure and attached the belt to one of the longitudinal steel beams with a makeshift hook made from chair legs. Judging by Shankar's blue face, he had hanged himself, at least an hour ago. Fanzio first removed the already cold body and laid it on the floor, then rushed to the communicator to call the doctor, the captain, and anyone else who should have been called. The brief investigation and subsequent meeting concerning the tragic accident made a strange impression on Fanzio. He had been invited as a direct witness to the discovery of the body. Dr. Stankovsky was mainly silent. He only stated Shankar's death and drew up a death report, which was also signed by the captain and the chief mate. During the whole meeting, which took place in the spacious living room of the captain's cabin, the doctor sat quietly at the far end of the table, away from the other participants, and wrote or drew something in his notebook, covering it from others' eyes. He answered the captain's and chief mate's questions in short words, and sometimes even offhandedly. Captain Casales, however, did not seem to care at all. Fanzio was completely confused. A man was dead. A good, friendly man had suddenly committed suicide, and they were as casual as if they were discussing the supply of toilet paper and disposable towels. Chief Mate Ndegwa even made a few remarks in half-voice that made Fanzio feel very uncomfortable. And how else to react to phrases like, "He was useless anyway," and "Now the air will only get cleaner"? Fanzio could feel the indignation and resentment building up in him. When he was about to burst, Captain Casales announced that everything was clear. The incident was over, and everyone could leave and go about their duties. Fanzio gave up. Over the decades, he had grown accustomed to his galley and the warm, friendly atmosphere of the mess hall. But here, among the senior officers, he felt uncomfortable. Something strange was happening with them. But who was he to question the captain's and chief's decisions? Fanzio and Ndegwa stood up. The captain was sitting in his chair, looking into space between his subordinates, and the doctor hesitated, finishing scribbling something in his notebook. What happened next? Fanzio could not have been imagined even in a terrible dream, even after the tragic death of Shankar. Ndegwa, who had already taken a step toward the exit, suddenly turned sharply toward the doctor, leaned across the table, and literally pulled Stankovsky out, grabbing him firmly by his clothes. The chief was a very strong man, and the stunned doctor hung in his grip like a rag doll. "Hey, you bloody vile gut ripper!" Ndegwa growled, looking straight into the doctor's eyes. "Are you trying to kill us all, you bastard? Just sitting here secretly, thinking how you can throw us all overboard and take it all for yourself? Well, you messed with the wrong guy, so watch out." And he literally threw Stankovsky through the doorway. The doctor, who had no time to understand or resist, flew like a mannequin into the corridor. Immediately, a muffled sound of a blow against the bulkhead was heard, followed by a quiet groan of pain. "And so it will be with everyone who just tries," Ndegwa said. But Fanzio sensed some uncertainty in his voice, as if the chief had suddenly begun to realize that he had done something wrong, but had not yet figured out what it was. Ndegwa gave a quick nod to the captain and walked out. Literally sprinted out of the cabin. His footsteps died away as soon as the chief rounded the corner. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Captain Casales asked in an indifferent tone. "I think it's time for you to go do the cooking. The crew needs a full meal." He remained silent, staring blankly at the space in front of him. "Off you go." When Fanzio stepped out into the corridor, the doctor was gone. Thank God there was no blood on the bulkhead or the deck, as the cook had feared. Apparently, the doctor had come to his senses quickly and hurried away from the mad chief mate. Fanzio understood him perfectly. Fanzio opened Stankovsky's notebook, which he had discreetly picked up during the wild incident with the chief and the doctor, and began leafing through it on his way to the galley. The first few pages were filled with the usual notes and memos, both work-related and personal. Fanzio didn't bother to read them. It was unlikely that free access to all the entries in the diary was part of the doctor's plans. But then, Fanzio looked with bewilderment and even fear at the pages of the notebook, all painted with some mysterious symbols. Images of monstrous creatures with many eyes, tentacles, and who knows what else, tearing apart spaceships, in one of which Fanzio easily recognized the good old Tantalus, and scraps of some rambling phrases like, "They have awakened and are hungry. The offering is inevitable. We must select the worthy. It is time for the ancients to return." At first, these phrases seemed to Fanzio to be just meaningless, crazy gibberish, especially when combined with the rest of the notebook's contents. However, he quickly remembered that the doctor was fond of old literature, especially of a mystical kind, describing all sorts of horrible ancient deities slumbering somewhere in the depths of the ocean, or the universe, or both. Fanzio didn't remember very well, waiting for their time to awaken and take over, or destroy, if they were in a particularly bad mood, the entire universe. Nonsense, of course. The usual harmless hobby of a weirdo doctor. In fact, many spacemen who worked on long-distance flights had strange hobbies, and Dr. Stankovsky did not stand out too much from the general background. But it was rare for anyone to go crazy because of his hobby, and certainly, no one yet managed to infect others. Fanzio had seen friction in different crews before, sometimes even escalating to noisy arguments and almost fights. But all these, as a rule, were banal cases of psychological incompatibility overlaid with fatigue from a long, tedious routine. Nothing like the madness that now seemed to have taken hold of the entire crew. At this disturbing thought, he stepped through the galley door, and at that moment, the lights went out everywhere. The ship's lighting was such a tiny fraction of the power consumption of the 3 main reactors that there was no need to turn off the lights anywhere, except maybe at night in personal quarters. Why save something that was within the margin of error? In fact, there wasn't even a light switch in the galley. The backup system should have kicked in when the main lights went out in any room, but it wasn't working. Fanzio stood in complete darkness, trying to figure out what to do now, until his attention was distracted by the sound of footsteps, the dragging of heavy object, and a metallic clinking near the far wall. Cook became alert, and that's when the emergency lighting system finally kicked in. Seeing what was happening where the noise had come from, Fanzio swallowed convulsively and drew back, blindly fumbling behind him on the cutting table until his hand found a large meat tenderizer. On the floor against the far wall, near the entrance to the frozen vegetable cooler, lay the body of Dr. Stankovsky. Judging by the winding trail of blood, someone had dragged him here from the farthest entrance to the galley, which overlooked the service gangway, one of 4 that connected all the decks of the Tantalus's living quarters. Actually, why someone? Fanzio could clearly see Captain Casales leaning over the doctor's body. Both Casales and the walls and floor around him were stained with blood. The captain, with the same blank expression on his face, had one of his hands in the dead man's ripped abdomen and was fumbling around. Nearby on the floor lay a large all-purpose chef's knife. Fanzio was horrified to recognize it as his favorite professional tool, which he preferred to all other knives. The cook grabbed the tenderizer, looking for something to use as a makeshift shield, but at that moment, the captain finally noticed him. "It's good of you to show up at last," he said, as if nothing had happened. "I really need your, professional help. It is obvious that something unusual is happening on the ship." "You bet," Fanzio thought, looking at the captain apprehensively. He didn't seem aggressive, but who knows what a madman might think. As if wanting to confirm Fanzio's opinion, the captain continued, "I think we're all infected. Dangerous parasites, you know? I've read that they can alter the behavior of their hosts. Where else would parasites come from other than the infirmary? I think the doctor infected himself, and then infected the others." He looked at the doctor's horribly mutilated body. "But I haven't been able to find anything yet. You know how to use this better than me." The captain pointed to the knife. "Give me a hand. The parasites must be in him somewhere. We just have to look hard enough." Realizing what the captain asked him to do almost forced Fanzio to throw up. He certainly didn't step toward the captain and Stankovsky's body, and he couldn't even make a sound in response. Apparently, that was a mistake. You're behaving normally, the captain said suddenly. Almost like me. Thank God I'm not, Fanzio thought. You're not infected either. How is that possible? The doctor was often in your galley on duty. You must have been infected. Something eerie flashed in his eyes. The captain rose slowly to his feet. Now I understand, he said. His monotonous, calm voice was monstrously out of tune with the nightmarish scene. You were in league with him. Only Stankovsky was careless and infected himself. Or not. You infected him. The most convenient way of infection is through food. You infected all of us, you. For a moment, the dazed and frightened Fanzio had a wild thought. What if everyone had indeed been infected with some brain disease? Everyone but him, because he's not really a... But at that moment, the captain jumped on him. Fanzio knocked him out with a tenderizer. And it finally became clear to him what he must do. The next half hour it took him to get to the ship's mainframe was like traveling through a nightmare. The journey from the galley to the lower tech deck was usually much quicker, about 10 minutes at most. However, Fanzio spent a lot of time hiding from the distraught crew members. People were behaving in the most unpredictable ways. Thank God, he had not seen any more monstrous incidents like the one with Shankar and Dr. Stankovsky. But he preferred to avoid those who were sitting in the corridors, screaming unintelligibly, banging their heads against the bulkheads, drawing indecipherable symbols and images on anything and so on. He managed to lock a few people in their quarters with a master key he'd pulled from the captain's pocket. Before leaving the galley, he dragged Casales a little to the side so that the recovering captain would not see the doctor's body, and tied him up securely, as best he could. A quick inspection showed that the hammer blow seemed to have been more or less accurate, and that the captain's skull was intact. If they manage to get out of here, the captain will have a very unpleasant and terrible time in the future, realizing what he'd done. If they really manage to get out, and if the captain can come to his senses. At least there was no one in the ship's mainframe vault. No one was screaming unintelligibly, waving some improvised weapon, or moaning, curled up in a fetal position in a corner. Fanzio pressed a button on the lock panel, and the door closed. The captain's master key allowed him to lock any door on the ship, even those whose user interfaces didn't have that option. And that came in handy, because for the next few minutes, Fanzio would be completely helpless. He had never done it, but only knew such a possibility existed. After the rebirth, everyone at the rehabilitation center was offered training, but it was voluntary. Fanzio had declined. He didn't want to be reminded that he wasn't quite human anymore. His origins were closely guarded by the law of the secret of identity, and he would be glad if that law could be applied to himself. But right now, he simply had no other choice. If the entire crew of the Tantalus had suddenly gone mad, all but himself, then something was very wrong. Fanzio had already begun to guess what it might be. There was only one way to check it, and only one way to save the ship and the crew if he was right. But to do that, Fanzio needed to connect directly to the mainframe. He had no understanding of how to work the main deckhouse navigation terminals. The mainframe was not the newest, but it was powerful enough. An 8th-generation subquantum computer whose potential intelligence was frozen at the very threshold of self-awareness, as required by artificial intelligence laws. Fanzio had heard that in the past, the reborn required direct physical contact with the computer. Simply put, they had to plug a cable into a carefully hidden socket somewhere on the body. For Fanzio, however, simple tactile contact with the special communication interface was enough. Fanzio sighed, flipped back the interface cover, and dipped both palms into the slightly rippling silver pseudo-liquid. The cramped room of the mainframe swirled around him, flickered, and vanished, and in its place, the abyss of galactic void spread around Fanzio. Fanzio merged and embraced the entirety of the Tantalus with all his newfound senses. After taking a few milliseconds to settle in, he began, figuratively speaking, to look around. Around the ship, hurtling through space, was the endless void, the almost starless space between the arms of the galaxy. Fanzio recalled that the proper use of the term referred to the gaps between galaxies, but for him and Tantalus, grains of sand and dust on a scale of unimaginable distances, the term seemed appropriate now. For thousands of light years, there was nothing but the ship itself and something else. It took Fanzio another few dozen seconds of observation and analysis to assess the situation. Forcibly deprived of self-awareness, the mainframe could perfectly cope with any navigational tasks, but, like any mechanism, would stall when encountering surprises not initially included in its program. And in the strangest and most unusual cases, it could even reject contradictory observation data, taking them for errors and mistakes of measurements. To detect them, one needed direct access to the sensors. Theoretically, any of the navigators could have gotten that access, but Captain Casales was now lying tied up in a blood-soaked galley, and the other officers were rampaging in their quarters or elsewhere, completely out of their minds. That left Fanzio. Along with the realization of what was happening came the realization of what had to be done. It was risky, since the ship was still in the dust cloud zone and the hyperdrive was not yet fully calibrated, but there was no time to delay. If they stayed here even 24 hours longer, they would all be screwed. Fanzio was not a navigator and had no idea how the hyperdrive trajectory was calculated. But he was directly connected to the mainframe and could order its parts to do things on their own that had previously been carefully controlled by the navigator on watch. As Fanzio ran the mainframe through all the stages of preparation for the hyperjump and finally gave the command, "Start," the universe around him exploded into billions of tiny rainbow particles, then collapsed and disappeared. Fanzio lost consciousness. Chief Mate Hassan Degwa, currently the ship's acting captain, sighed and turned away from the communications console. "The rescue team will be here in 6 days," he said, "though all they have left to do is evacuate the casualties and the bodies." He shook his head. 5 dead, 11 people in isolation, almost a third of the crew. Degwa looked at Fanzio. "If it hadn't been for you, all of us would have had to be evacuated. We'd still be trapped in there. But how did you figure it out?" Fanzio felt out of place again. He suspected that he would have to get used to the feeling for a while now. When practically the whole crew of the Tantalus, except for me, seemed to go crazy. Well, at first, I couldn't understand anything either because I was confused and scared. But as soon as I thought about it for a moment, I began to realize something. I was the only one who remained reasonable. And yet, I was the only one different from the rest of the crew. I mean, I didn't know for sure, but you know, the odds of 2 reborns on the same crew. Yes, Degwa nodded. I admit, I've always been a little wary of the rebirth project. The very idea that human consciousness could be written into an artificial inorganic brain, and then that brain could be put back into the body. I didn't like that idea very much. Some kind of psychological atavism, I suppose. But I'm going to have to rethink that attitude now. I understand, Fanzio agreed. He remembered his own hesitation when he had been offered to participate in the experiment. Even though the incurable brain tumor left him no chance of survival if he refused. There wasn't a great chance of success for the complicated consciousness transplant operation either, about 30%. But it was better than a guaranteed 0. He agreed. Anyway, when I connected to the mainframe, Don't ask me what it was like. I can't put it into words anyway. I quickly realized what was wrong. This, by the way, was partly influenced by our poor captain's words about parasites, and by the doctor's crazy visions as well. Perhaps their psyche interpreted reality that way through their beliefs and knowledge. The irony, and a sad one, was that we ourselves were the parasites, the disease-causing microbes in a giant, incredible organism. If that term, of course, even applies here. What do you mean? Ndegwa stared at Fanzio. As far as I understand it, the Tantalus was caught in some huge dust cloud capable of causing electromagnetic interference in specific ranges that affect the human brain. Your brain is inorganic. Excuse me for being blunt. So you, unlike the rest of the crew, were not affected by this interference, and you managed to put the Tantalus into hyperjump mode and escape from the cloud. A risky maneuver, very risky, especially since you're not a navigator, but I suppose, under the circumstances, justified. What's that got to do with microbes, parasites, and all that? Fanzio sighed. It's hard to explain, but when I tapped into the mainframe and threw it to all of the Tantalus's sensors and surveillance systems, I sort of sensed it, the cloud. It's alive. Not in the sense that you and I are, of course, but definitely alive. No intelligence, I think, or it's so far beyond our comprehension that we can never make contact with it. But I sensed that it was hurt, if you will. The Tantalus was literally piercing through its body, and I think our thoughts were somehow affecting it too, hurting it. And it began to defend itself, like our bodies defend themselves against harmful germs. He smiled sadly. Ndegwa shook his head, and as a result, several people are dead, and many more, including the captain, are in the isolation ward, tranquilized to the state of vegetables. Who knows if they will ever recover from such psychological trauma? For an interstellar dust cloud, that's a pretty effective immune system. I still have very creepy memories of the wild delirium that was circulating in my head at the time. It's a bit humiliating for a civilization capable of traveling all across the galaxy, right? Fanzio said. But I guess we were something like malarial plasmodia or a moving cancerous tumor to this creature. I just hope the population of these living nebulae isn't too large, or we might have to get used to this new role. He grinned. No one likes to think of themselves as a trivial parasite,